All right, we're glad to have everybody here tonight. We're going to have a discussion, a follow up from this morning. We're going to talk about a completely different aspect of something I could have preached on this morning, but I try to make the sermons on Sunday morning and kind of go down one track, even though there are multiple things you can talk about. So hopefully, I want to encourage everybody to have a lot of input tonight. I see a lot of people fanning themselves. It's just this time of year. I'm gonna get with. I'll get with either Gary or John this week, and we'll make sure that these air conditioners here are working good. It's just when it gets this hot, it's hard for the temperature to keep up and blow adequately. But we may have to make sure these air conditioners start earlier in the afternoon. Maybe not stop after Sunday morning, but it'll be better next week. But it's better than it was at Bila Battery, right? Yes, yes, Sarah. It's pretty cold inside this building in Bilo Battery. What about outside? Not if you're on, not if you're on the roof. Extra blankets. Okay, you won't need any tonight in here. All right. Anyway, it could be worse, right? At least there's air blowing. So anyway, we'll make sure we get that better than it was. Been talking about how to be an Acts church, and being an Acts church is, it's about how you act. God wants us to act differently. Christians are not just to believe different things, we're to live differently, right? That's what it means to be a Christian. It doesn't just mean, hey, we hold to this set of doctrines. Yes, we hold to a set of doctrines, but those doctrines are meant to change the way that you behave. What you believe is supposed to influence how you behave. If it doesn't, something has not gone right internally in our conversion process. And so we looked at this. And of course, I think this sermon this morning was very, very practical. This is something that all of us deal with. We've all had, unfortunately, lots of times in our life where we've had conflicts and disagreements with people over a lot of different things. And the point that I made this morning that hopefully sticks with us throughout this week is this. When we have disagreements with people, we need to care enough to work things out rather than to walk out. So I want to stop right here and I want to invite some discussion. I want you to, anybody, discuss along these lines. What other practical implications from what we talked about this morning, this disagreement that Paul and Barnabas had over who to take with them on the second missionary journey? Are there any other practical implications from that or anything else you saw in the text this morning to our lives? Roy? It was real heated. Yeah. Okay. Okay, out of controversy came a plus. We'll talk about that further here in just a moment. You're stealing some of my thunder, but you're right. But you read my notes. You read the Bible. That's right. That's good. Okay. What else? Did I see somebody else's hand up over here? What else? Practical implications. Okay, people grow up and they mature. I'm sure that's what Barnabas was saying. I'm sure in the discussion, the heated argument that he and Paul were having, I'm sure that's exactly the argument that Barnabas was making. And certainly, John Mark did grow up a lot. As I mentioned this morning, in scholarly circles, they'll tell you John Mark became a protege of Peter and spent a lot of time with him. And John Mark is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel that was written, even though it's recorded second in the New Testament. Pretty much universally, every scholar will tell you that the Gospel of Mark is the gospel that the other gospels kind of base their gospels on that, except for John. John's completely different. But so certainly he matured and he grew up a lot. Anything else from this morning? Ozzy? They're doing well. Right. Yeah. And that's, and I think, we all know the Great Commission. I think most of us do, Matthew 28. We're good about the baptizing part. You know, Jesus said, "Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father." That's the part we get well. The second part of that is what we don't do so good in, teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you. Surely I'm with you always to the end of the age. It's sometimes that follow-up. Paul and Barnabas, you know, Paul proposes this, hey, we need to go back. This is about a year later after the first missionary journey was over. Barnabas agrees. Barnabas agreed with that. That wasn't the disagreement. The disagreement is, you know, who are we going to allow to go with us on this second missionary journey? See, I think, doesn't it kind of help you, even though it doesn't excuse times when we get hot-headed and angry, and that's why I requested of Ken, you know, I send Ken every week, usually by Friday morning, I send him the whole PowerPoint, and sometimes I'll think of a song that goes with that. Sometimes he or Clay or whoever's leading singing will say, hey, can you think of any songs? I don't know the songs as well in my head as Ken does, but sometimes I thought, well, Angry Words, the one that he did lead this morning, I thought that will go well with this sermon today. And the song that he just led just a second ago, the Lord will find a way when there seems to be no way. He works in ways we cannot see. The Lord will find a way for me. That's going to fit with some things that we're going to talk about tonight. But one thing that I want to mention, I said this kind of in passing this morning. I didn't have a PowerPoint for it, but this was an important little phrase for this morning. Did you notice in that disagreement, and it was a sharp disagreement. Remember, I pointed out what that word, it's a medical term. It means to have, you know, like a seizure and a high fever. I mean, or convulsions and a high fever. I mean, this was a heated argument. It's not like they were politely, oh, well, I didn't see it that way. They were mad. Neither one of them handled it very well. I think it helps us when we do things like that to understand it happened even to Paul. I don't know about you, but I count Paul as being fairly spiritually mature, right? And I say that tongue in cheek. I mean, Paul's up here, right? Humanness happens even to Paul. So it happens to us as well. Yes, Ken. Who have forsaken me, and yeah. Yeah. No, I think he had a pretty fiery personality, more than likely. Read Galatians sometimes. First part of Galatians, he doesn't start that letter off the way he does most letters. He's kind of hot. He's hot that they've allowed some people to come in there and to undermine his teaching of grace, how we're saved, and so on and so forth. Come on in, Andy. How you doing? You're just in time. We're just getting started. Gunner's right there. Hey, just okay. The phrase I was going to say is, you notice in this argument that they had, this disagreement they had this morning, Luke, who wrote Acts, does not point out who was right or wrong. He doesn't say, well, I'm siding with Paul or I'm siding with Barnabas. Now, I think there's some reasons for that, but I think the one thing he's trying to get across to us is, you know, what they're arguing about is not something that is at the core of the gospel. It's not like whoever's wrong ends up teaching heresy, right? It's a matter of opinion and judgment. And in matters like that, which many of our arguments and disagreements are, aren't they? In those kind of matters, the relationship is more important than who is right. Now, I forget that a lot. Maybe you do too. God cares about our relationships. And since God cares so much about our relationships, we should care very, very much about our relationships. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about before I get going down the track that I've prepared to go on, but this is very important. This principle right here, this little phrase, I think is really good. Care enough to work things out rather than walk out. Can't we all admit that we are prone, we have a tendency, regardless of who the disagreement is with or what the disagreement is over, the easiest thing to do is just walk out. Would you agree with that? That doesn't take any work. It takes work to work things out. So the question I want to ask is this. What does this principle, this saying right here, which is the principle from the text, what does this principle have to say about our commitment to this local church, the Landmark Church of Christ? I want to talk about that for a minute. Do you see any applications from this principle to your commitment and my commitment to this church? Okay? If you have a tendency, you know, to get hot, hey, don't go in there with angry words, right? Let's calm that down first, okay? That's good advice. What else? Right? Okay, right. Right. Yeah, and that church at Bible Battery needs follow-up. You know, just something that might be worth thinking about in the future. It might be worth us thinking about, hey, can we go there more than once a year? That church is a teetling church. Really hinges on two people, Billy and Daphne. It's been that way ever since Laura and I have known them, going back to 2009. And really, after them, something's going to have to be done. They're not young. Daphne is 81 or somewhere around. Billy is 70-something. So they're not young people, really good people for those of you who haven't met them. Hard workers, servants. But it's not a church like this where you have a whole bunch of families who can contribute and help. It's totally different. It's a different type of church, very different type of church. Here's what I want to talk about. I'm going to tell you, here's a thing that bothers me as a preacher about as much as anything, if I can share something with you. Here's what really I'm like, I just don't understand. And it happens all the time. And it's not like this is the only church it's happened about. This is a kind of a universal phenomenon in churches. People think so little of church these days that they will just walk out on their church family rather than trying to work things out. It's happened at this church a bunch of times. People get upset over something. There's some kind of disagreement that they have had with somebody over something. And instead of going to the people who they need to work things out with, instead of doing that, they just leave. What does that tell you about a person's thinking regarding church and Scripture? I'll tell you what it tells me, but I want to know what you think about it. What does that tell you? How is the church referred to in the New Testament? The church is the bride of Christ. Now, I'm just going to tell you, if somebody came to me and said, Mike, I don't have a problem with you, but I really have a problem with your wife, and started running my wife down, well, then there's going to be a problem with me. Correct? And so we have this mentality in our whole culture that Jesus matters. Yes, I need to have a relationship with Jesus, but the church doesn't matter. That is not biblical, brothers and sisters. The church is called the bride of Christ. The church is also called another main metaphor. The church is the body, and the church is the family. This family language, brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so. In fact, the church I grew up in Odessa, that's what we called everybody. Nobody called the preacher. His name was Charles. I never once called him, hey, Charles. In my wildest imagination, I wouldn't have thought of doing that. It was, hello, Brother Jones. Everybody called each other brother and sister. I still think that would be a good thing. There's this familial language that you see in the New Testament. And so I've asked this, I remember I preached a sermon a long time ago where I asked this question. I started off as a thought-provoking statement to get everybody thinking. And I asked this statement, and I want you to think about it. Think about your family. You, your husband, your wife, your children, who live in the same house as you do right now, or did at one point if they're already grown. Now, I want you to think about this. What would it take for you to walk out on your family? What would it take for you to get up and just walk out and not come back? What would it take? A mental breakdown. Wouldn't it take something absolutely astronomical that I can't even think about? In my case, I'll say it would take something I can't even conceive of. To walk out on my wife and daughter? That never crossed my mind. To just leave them high and dry? And we all in here, I think, hopefully, and I'm pretty sure, you guys would agree, I wouldn't do that for any. I've got to be committed to them. I've made a commitment to them, right? Isn't the church the same way? If the church, if God intentionally inspired those writers to say, make sure you use these metaphors, the bride of Christ, the body, the family, then why is it that we have very little, sometimes, or no commitment to the church to where even if the slightest thing happens, and these usually aren't major deals, they're some slight little thing, people just leave. I think you're right. So here's what I want to say to those of you who are in here tonight, and maybe those who will be listening to this online. Here's what I want to say. God forbid, I hope that you never have any kind of issues or any kind of disagreements with anybody in this body. I hope that doesn't happen. But I'm going to be a realist. Because we're dealing with people, imperfect people here, it's a real good chance that there's going to be times, there's going to be friction between you and someone at this church over something. Right? Here's what I plead and implore you to do. Not if that happens, but most likely when that happens. Here's what I would plead with you to do. This. Care enough to work things out rather than walk out. This is your church family. Families are committed to each other. We should be as committed to this family as we are to our biological families. The church is God's idea, right? So I hope all of us will think about that. If in the future, when something happens, someone says something, and I'll tell you, here's what it a lot of times will revolve around, and I can understand this. Let me just use an example of my wife. Y'all know my wife. She's the nicest person as you're going to find, right? If you can't get along with my wife, you have serious problems. If you can't get along with her, who are you going to get along with, right? I can understand why you don't get along with me sometimes, because I have strong opinions on stuff. Her, she's sweet, she's nice, she gets along with everybody. But I'm going to tell you something. If you were to cross our daughter, if you were to do something evil to our daughter, you will see a side of her you don't want to see. You will see energy coming out that you don't want to be around. And if you're a mom or a dad, you know what I'm talking about. We go into ultra hyper protective mode of our kids. Am I right, Jenna? If someone were to do something to Hannah, Jenna's also a nice person. Jason's like, well, you ought to see her before she has coffee in the morning. That's what Robert says about Lisa sometimes. But if somebody were to mess with Hannah, do something bad to them, I bet you don't want to be around Jana, right? So what usually happens in a church is a lot of times these issues revolve our kids. Somebody has said something to one of our kids. Somebody has done something to one of our kids. Or we perceive that someone has said or offended one of our kids or excluded one of our kids or whatever. Sometimes it's those issues. Once again, and I understand, how emotional we can get when those things happen, but if we would please remember this, care enough to work things out rather than to walk out. That person or persons, that man or that woman that we're having issues with and disagreement with at the time is our brother and sister in Christ. So let's care enough to work things out rather than walk out. Okay, go ahead, Roy. Yeah, we do need to keep it intact, and that's all dependent upon us and how we deal with issues when they come up. Okay, anybody else before we move on here? Anything else? Okay, I want to bring the map up to you. This is a map of Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey. They start right here in Antioch. They go down here to Cyprus. This is where Barnabas was originally from. They start over here in this town. They walk 90 miles across to this coastal town of Paphos. Then they go up here to Pamphylia, and according to the text of Acts, it is right here up in Pamphylia when they get to the mainland up here. That is where John Mark leaves them and goes back. We don't know the reason. Maybe it was because, things got too tough, because this is a very rugged, mountainous region up here. He's like, we're going to have to climb snow-capped mountains? I didn't sign up for this. Maybe he got sick. We don't know what it was, but he deserted them and went back. And then Paul and Barnabas, of course, they go through this Galatian region right here to these cities of Pisidian Antioch, and then they go to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, and then they turn around and go back, and then they come back and they give a report to the church at Antioch. Okay, get that map in your mind for a second. That's the first missionary journey. Okay, and after this first missionary journey, they had the Jerusalem conference that I preached on last Sunday in Acts chapter 15. And then about a year after this first missionary journey, that's when the passage that Chad mentioned just a moment ago, Acts 15, verse 36, where Paul says to Barnabas, he says, hey, why don't we go and revisit the people the brethren that we have visited earlier, and let's see how they are doing. And Barnabas agreed, yes, we need to go back and check on them. So the plan was, they were basically going to retrace their steps, probably go down here through Cyprus like they'd done before, go up here, go to these cities, Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, and then come back. That was their plan. Okay, then they have this big disagreement, and they have this big argument. And as a result of their big argument, God's going to use this big argument. Now, I want to point something out. God did not cause the argument. The argument was caused by sin in Paul and Barnabas, and both of them being hard-headed and not working things out. They simply walked out instead of working things out at first. Later they did work it out. But God did use this split to guide both of these men to greater service and greater productiveness in His kingdom. I want to show you the second missionary journey. The second missionary journey was going to look like this at first, but here's what it actually looks like. The second missionary journey, Barnabas and John Mark, they go down here through Cyprus again, and then they probably go back up and retrace their steps up here. But notice where Paul goes. He starts there in Antioch, and him and Silas, his new traveling companion, they go up this way, and then they go over to here. And you might remember right in this area right in here, Paul This is recorded in your Bible in Acts chapter 16. Paul is wanting to go up here to Asia. He wants to go up here, but for some reason, he keeps having this feeling that he's not sure where to go. And you might remember he ends up over here in this coastal town of Troas. And it's in Troas where there is a man from Macedonia. Macedonia is right over here where Philippi is. A man across the sea right here, across the Aegean Sea. He has this vision of a man over there. And the man says, come over here and help us. In fact, Ken, you remember the song that this is based on? Do what? Yeah, I've heard the Macedonian call today. I've heard the Macedonian call today, send the light. It's based on this, where Paul hears this voice of a man of Macedonia saying, come over here to help us. Now, here's the point that I want to make. As a result of them splitting, as a result of this terribly difficult situation that happened, this argument that happened, this frustration that happened, and all the heartache, out of that, God brought greater productivity than would have happened before. What God does is, when they go across the Aegean Sea and over here, they step foot in Europe and they bring the gospel to Europe for the first time. God used this situation that happened for greater productivity and greater spread of the gospel. And that's what God does. That's the kind of God God is. That doesn't mean that what happened and the attitudes that they each exhibited, Paul and Barnabas, in their disagreement, that doesn't mean that it was good. It wasn't good. They both acted inappropriately. But here's the kind of God God is. No matter what happens, no matter how badly we mess up, it's not like our life is done. And that's good to know, because we all have experience in messing up, don't we? Oh, I made a bad choice. Yeah, sometimes we do. That doesn't mean God is done with you, or you can't be productive in His kingdom. In fact, God will say, you know, you did mess up, but I'm going to take that mess up, and we're going to use that, and I'm going to work powerfully through you as a result of it. So it's often through our difficulties, it's often through our problems, a lot of times it's through our failures, that God uses those to allow us to be much more productive for Him. I love this great verse in Ephesians. It says, furthermore, because we're united with Christ, we have received an inheritance from God, for He chose us in advance. And I love the way it translates this. He makes everything work out according to His plan. Now, it doesn't say that everything that happens is according to God's plan, but He makes everything work out according to His plan. Not everything that we do is according to God's plan, but God is so great that He says, you know what? I'll take that mess up that you did, and I will make it work out according to my plan. Okay, now I want us to have a little bit of a discussion here, and we're going to look at some passages in Scripture. Let me ask you this question. When you think about this disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, what could they have done differently? When Paul says, hey, let's go back and revisit the brethren, and Barnabas brings up John Mark, what could they have done? Besides fan themselves, which I see a lot of people doing, what else could they have done? Could they have come to a compromise? Well, the problem was over who to take, John Mark. I mean, that was the problem. Okay. You know, the word that I pointed out this morning, the Greek word that I looked up this week, that word disagreement in Acts chapter 15, you know, it doesn't mean they had some kind of mild disagreement. They had a knockdown, drag-out argument. The word, as I mentioned this morning, that word for disagreement in the original language is used for convulsions and a high fever. They likely got red-faced. They got loud. They said things that they later would have regretted. That ever happened to you before? Or am I the only one that's, the only one that has experience with that? Uh, and when you get like that, a lot of times you're not thinking clearly, and it doesn't contribute to a good conversation, does it? And it just deteriorated from there, and that's when they just decided, well, we're done. We're walking out. Of course, I showed this morning. Later, they did reconcile. It's pretty obvious from the rest of the New Testament. But could they have come to a compromise? We're not talking about a doctrinal issue, are we? It wasn't a doctrinal issue. It was over John Mark. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say anything like that. Apparently, it sounds like it was over because it states in the text the reason Paul was against it is because John Mark had abandoned them on the first missionary journey. Paul sees him as undependable and unreliable, and on the second journey, we don't need somebody who's going to abandon us again. That seems to be the issue. So it's not like they're giving up something that's a matter of their convictions. So it seems to me like they could have compromised. Something I read in a book here, I think this is really good. Listen to this. He says, Paul or Barnabas, they could have offered a reasonable compromise. Giving in would not have meant heresy. There was no hard and fast doctrinal issue that was at stake. Paul might have said, now this is conjecture, but it's reasonable. Paul might have said, we'll tell him that he's on a temporary period of probation. And if he doesn't stay strong and stable during the early months, then we'll send him back home. Paul could have said that, but probably what prevented him from saying that is he was too mad, too angry to say that. Barnabas could have said, he could have conceded this. He could have said, we definitely need faithful workers on our team, Paul. So why don't we do this? Let's give Mark a minor assignment here in Antioch. Let's see if he fulfills his responsibilities. Meanwhile, we'll go ahead on our journey, and if he measures up to his responsibilities, then we'll send for him, and he can join us later on the journey. Barnabas could have said that. They could have agreed on a contingent plan. Let's take Mark and a few others, and if Mark defects again, like he did on the first journey, then we'll have the others to fall back on. There are things that they could have done where they could have come to a compromise. But when you get so mad and you get so angry and your emotions take over and you're all red-faced and you're yelling and hollering and screaming, that just doesn't help productivity any at all. And I think all of us have experience with that. Yeah, God used that. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, yes, God used this unfortunate episode that happened. God used it to bring about his greater glory, the opening up of the European continent to the gospel. Yes. That doesn't excuse their behavior, though, does it? And it doesn't excuse our behavior. It's not like we should be thinking, well, it doesn't matter what I do, God's going to use this and he'll forgive me, which is true, but that doesn't excuse our behavior. They should not have done that. Paul and Barnabas both were sinning in the way that they were dealing with each other on that occasion. But they should have come to a compromise, could have come to a compromise. For whatever reason, they just didn't. There's some things, go ahead, Steve, and then Jason. Right. Right. Yeah, if you look at it, Luke, as I pointed out, doesn't say which one was right or wrong. I think both Paul and Barnabas had legitimate points. As Steve was just pointing out, rightfully so. He probably did, since they were related, probably had some personal conversations with John Mark. And John Mark probably apologized, said, I assure you that won't happen again. And he probably had grown. A year had gone by. He had probably grown and matured and learned from his experience on the first journey. So you can understand Barnabas has a legitimate viewpoint. Paul also has a legitimate viewpoint. Hey, this is serious stuff we're doing here. We're going on a mission trip, and we don't need people to abandon us who we're dependent upon halfway through the mission trip. So you can see both sides, but the point is, neither one of them would give in. They could have met in the middle and come up with some of these contingency plans that are postulated in the quote that I just read you from that book. But there's some things that we need to remember in disagreements, because all of us are going to have disagreements. Everybody in this room has already had disagreements with people in the past, and it's likely that we will continue to have disagreements with people in the future. So to follow up with what we're just now talking about, you got to remember this. In the disagreements that we're going to have with people that are not based on hard and fast doctrinal teachings, there's one issue, but there are several viewpoints. Now, let's admit it. We have a tendency, I do, and many of you probably do too, we have a tendency to only look at it from my viewpoint. The other person has a legitimate viewpoint as well. As in this case, Paul had a legitimate viewpoint, and Barnabas had a legitimate viewpoint. Ken? Jason. Yeah. Right. Apparently they did, or else Luke wouldn't have used the word. Luke was a medical doctor, and he used a medical term, and he knows what that medical term means. This was an ugly argument that they had. Okay, they could have done better, like all of us. I've had many times I'm like, boy, I didn't do good there. I really contributed to the degeneration of this discussion, and I could have done a lot better if I would have just been calm and rational. But sometimes we don't. But there are legitimately that we need to try to understand things in an argument from the other person's viewpoint. In fact, I want to show you a passage that I think speaks to this. It's in the book of Romans chapter 14. We're going to read verses 3 through 6. Romans 14, verse 3 through 6. Now, the issue under discussion here is not this, but there's a principle here that does apply. Romans 14, beginning in verse 3. The setting here is you have a church full of Jews and Gentiles. Jews have been kicked out of Rome for 5 years in the year AD 49. In the year AD 54, the Roman emperor dies. The edict that he had that told the Jews to leave Rome was rescinded. So the Jews start coming back to Rome, and now this formerly Jewish Gentile church was now just an all-Gentile church, and it caused problems in their customs that they each tolerated. And so the two issues that they were having, that they were debating over, that were causing problems in their church, were over diets, what you can eat, and days, special holy days, whether to observe them, not observe them, or whatever. Those are the issues. Now I want you to listen closely at what Paul says to this. Romans 14, verse 3. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day, he observes it in honor of the Lord. And the one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains from eating, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. The point from that passage is this. Here you have people of two diametrically opposing views, and it says that God welcomes and honors both of them. And from their viewpoint, one of them says, well, I'm not going to eat that, and I'm not going to observe that holy day. And the other one says, yes, I am going to observe that holy day. It says God honors both viewpoints. God sees, hey, this person who says, I'm not going to eat, and the person who says, I am going to eat, both of them are doing it to the Lord. In other words, they have good motives. Let's admit this. A lot of times when we're having a disagreement with someone, don't we have a tendency to impugn their motives? Not just what they're saying. Well, I know what they're thinking. Do we really know what they're thinking? I don't. Sometimes I may think I do in the heat of an argument. But the point is, our viewpoint, when it's not on a hard and fast doctrinal issue, there are some doctrinal issues that are set in stone. There's one God, the creator God of everything. And salvation is through Jesus, period. I'm not going to accept another viewpoint on that. Right? But on most other things, let's admit it, most of the things that we have disagreements on are not over hard and fast doctrinal issues. They're on things that we can compromise on. And the other person who sees it very different than us has a different viewpoint. God himself says, I honor that viewpoint. We need to learn to honor other people's viewpoints. Chad? Yeah, just because they were having issues. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Right. That shows you their commitment to the Lord and to his cause and to his mission expanding. Yeah, that's a good point. You know, I'm trying to remember this verse. Let's see if I can find it. Proverbs 15. Hang on a second. Yeah, here it is. Look at this verse. Proverbs 15, verse 1. This is a good verse. I hadn't planned on this, but just kind of popped in my head here. Proverbs 15, verse 1. When we get in these arguments with people, this is a really good verse that if you have it in your, I've found that if you have it memorized, if it's in your head, you can use it when things get volatile. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So the way I like to picture that verse in Proverbs is when you're having a disagreement with someone, imagine, when things get hot and heated, when there's fire, you might say, to use this analogy I'm about to use. Imagine that this fire that you're going to, this dispute that is broken out, you have two buckets in your hand. One is a bucket of water, and one is a bucket of gasoline. Which one are you going to throw on the fire? Sometimes, yeah. If you want it to get worse, you throw the gasoline on it. That means you get mad, you get red-faced, and you start screaming and yelling. I have never had a time where that worked well. I don't know about you, but it has never worked well for me. But I have had times when I chose to say, I'm going to throw the water on it. and it completely disarms the other person. Janet, you were going to make a comment? Sometimes it does. And some people are so unreasonable, there's nothing you can do with them. But let me tell you something that happened to me a long time ago. When we lived in Kentucky, we lived in this nice neighborhood, and we had good neighbors, and we got along with all of them very well, except for one. And it wasn't just me; it was also Laura. There was a guy. This was when Tiffany was little, and we had one of those Walmart swimming pools, a pretty good size one up in our backyard, and we all would have, family swim time. We just had a ball out in that swimming pool. Well, we didn't have a fence up around our yard, and our next door neighbor didn't have a fence up either. And he had made a comment to my wife one time. He said, "I don't like seeing you and your daughter and your family out there in your swimming suits. I'm going to put up a big fence to block that." Just angry and hateful. And so, when I get wind of that, it kind of made me mad. But here's the thing. Here's what God was doing to me at this time. I was teaching at our church where I was the preacher at. I was teaching the book of Proverbs. And I had just taught this passage that I just read to you a moment ago. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And so I was out there weed eating one day, doing some lawn work, and this guy was out there also, and you could tell he wanted to talk to me. He was like, "Come here," kind of like that. He was kind of mad. And in my head, fortunately, the Holy Spirit put, remember Proverbs 15:1? A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And so I did remember it. And so I go over and talk to him. He was real mad, and he goes, "I don't like seeing your family swimming that swim. I'm going to put up a fence up here. Just a big fence to block it." And here's what I said to him. Now, there have been times in my life where I would have said, "Who do you think you are?" Throwing gasoline on the problem. But on this occasion, I did well. I said, "Oh, really? What kind of fence you going to put up?" He goes, and I said, "Let me know whenever you're going to put it up. I'll help you put it up." And it completely disarmed the guy. He didn't know what to say. He just kind of stood there and looked at me. And I said, "No, seriously." And I did mean it. Whenever you get ready to put that fence up, let me know. I'll be more than happy to help you out. And I said, "Well, I'm going to finish my weed eating now, so have a good day." And he just kind of stood there like dumbfounded. He didn't know what to say. He never did put the fence up. And we continued to swim, and it wasn't a problem after that. Now, there have been other times in my life where there have been other situations with other people where instead of throwing water on it, I threw gasoline on it. And it didn't go nearly as well. One last thing that I want to share. We got to remember when we're having arguments and disagreements with people, when we get heated and things get volatile like they did with Paul and Barnabas, usually somebody gets hurt. And that's what we got to remember. We got to remember this is a person, a human being created in God's image that we're having this disagreement with. I want you to look at this passage with me in the book of 1 Peter chapter 4. Just a couple more verses and we'll be done. 1 Peter 4, verse 7 and 8. Peter is reminding this church, and by implication, he's reminding us of some things. Look what he says in 1 Peter 4, verse 7. "The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. And above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins." He connects two thoughts together. And the two thoughts are, you know what? The end of all things is coming. And so you need to make sure you're treating people right, is the thought that he's giving. Since we're going to give an account to God one day of how we treat these people that he has created, keep in mind that person that we are having a disagreement with, that is a child of God. All people, in a sense, are children of God, right? They are his creation. And God values them highly, very highly. And since he does, I don't think he appreciates it if we don't value them highly as well. One more verse, and this one's in the book of Philippians. Philippians 4, verse 5. "Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand." You see the connection there? Here's why we need to be reasonable in our dealings with people, because the Lord is at hand. We're going to have to stand before God in judgment. And we're going to have to give an account to God of how we dealt with people. And if we are always harsh And if we're unreasonable, I don't think God is going to appreciate that on the day of judgment. So these are just some things for us to keep in mind. Not if disagreements come with people, but when they come, because unfortunately it's inevitable. All right, I hope today's been a blessing to you, and I hope we all will remember. I'm going to put this phrase up here again. I hope we'll all remember this. We need to care enough to work things out rather than to walk out, regardless of who the situation happens with or where it happens, because relationships are worth it. Appreciate everybody being here today. Ken's going to lead us in a song of encouragement. And if we need to pray for you, let's all be praying for, Buck and Patsy. A granddaughter was killed in a car accident. That'd be tough, wouldn't it? So we need to make sure that we remember them, make sure that you call them, show your love and support for them this week. And if we can help you in any kind of way, allow us to do that. Let's be standing as we sing this song of encouragement.